by accident, sort of like the monkey who fell out of the.
Bob, can you tell us briefly how you began in this field?
How I began in this field? Well, I can give you a very specific answer.
Okay.
It was 32 years ago that I first got into this field. How did I get into this field? By accident, sort of like the monkey who fell out of the tree. My company, which I had at the time, was involved up until 1956 in very extensive network radio programs, which means dramatic programs for radio nationwide and overseas. And in 1956, we had the choice of whether we converted all the way into television. And so we had started to do so until we discovered a very interesting thing. Now, we had been doing these radio programs for many years. And what we discovered was that it was like seeing a movie all over again. This is where we came in, because we were taking exactly the same thing that we had done 8 to 10 years earlier and putting a picture to it. It was nothing more to us than radio with a picture. So we did not think that we wanted to go through this all over again. There must be something better to do than to go into television. And we had already 2 quiz shows in television and found that this was nice, but there must be something better. So as the head of the company, and knowing in American language, we have something that says you pass the buck. The buck ends with the president of the company, the responsibility, as does the authority. So I decided we would try something else. And being very professional in sound, we naturally began to think of some way to use sound as a new means of a new direction for our company. And what we first came up with and started conducting in our research and development division of our company was how to help people learn while they are asleep. Very interesting parable. But all the way back in 1956, we started conducting studies how to do this. And the first problem is how to get people to sleep. Because you can't take a subject and say, now go to sleep. You have to, and you do not want to give them chemicals or drugs to go to sleep, because that won't serve the purpose. So we began to use sound to help people to get to sleep. And that's how we first began to get into the technology of what we have since become. But along the way, a very interesting thing took place. In that research pattern, I was the chief subject because I demanded it, because I was very curious. So as the chief subject in all of these patterns of finding ways to help people go to sleep by sound use, evidently I absorbed something, because in 1958, then I had this great, frightening, terrifying change take place in my life. And I have written about this, as you know, in several books, and that's very, I guess, common knowledge even throughout the world, because the books have been translated into various languages. But simply put, at that time, I began to experience moving out of my body. And that was the final thing of something that had begun a year at least or more before that time. I began to have, quote, dreams about, and I was an airplane pilot, so you can understand how that would take place. I began to have dreams about taxiing to the runway on an airport and getting the plane off the ground. And once I got it off the ground, that I would look up and here are all these wires. It was as if one were flying down the street, and there were all these power lines overhead and telephone lines, and you couldn't find a hole to get out of it. And that dream had gone on, a recurring dream for at least a year. And then shortly before this big thing took place in 58, I also began to experience a funny kind of vibration. And I went to it was as if my body were shaking, but there was no feeling of shaking. It was just internal. And I went hurrying to my favorite doctor, and he examined me and says, "Oh, you are working too hard. You are stress-filled, but there's nothing wrong with you. Go take a pill and relax or something." Well, not necessarily being a pill taker, that did not work too well. But in any event, after many times, like 25 or 30 more times of experiencing this vibration, I thought, well, and fighting to get out of it is the point. I just pull myself away from this vibration. The next step was, well, this will never get anywhere. I'm too frightened about it. If it's going to kill me, let it kill me. So with that in mind, one particular afternoon when I was lying down, I said, all right, fine. The vibration came. If it's going to kill me, let it kill me. So I waited and waited and waited. And after a while, after about 5 minutes, it faded away. I was still alive. So I thought, now I know it won't kill me. So I'm on safe ground. So after that, I began to simply let it happen and wait that 5 minutes so I could do something. And on this one famous night, as we're in 1958, I was lying in bed on a Friday night, waiting for this vibration to end so I could go to sleep. And as I was lying there thinking about what I was going to do the next day, while this vibration got through doing what it was supposed to do, I was thinking how nice Saturday morning was going to be, because we had what we call a cold front come through, and there would be strong northwest winds, and there would be great thermal action. So being much into sailplanes and gliders at that time, the soaring was going to be tremendous. And as a result, this was my sense of great joy and anticipation as I was waiting for this vibration to end. And as I waited and waited and thought how nice this is going to be, suddenly I felt something bumping against my shoulder. And that, of course, is part of the history when I discovered that what I was bumping against was the ceiling of my bedroom. And that bumping turned around, and I did not know where I was till I saw this funny sort of a fountain coming out of what I thought was the floor. And I thought, where am I? This is a funny kind of dream. And I looked more closely, and I thought there's something terribly wrong. This is not a fountain. This is the chandelier, the light fixture coming out of the ceiling. So I looked around, and sure enough, down there in the bed below me was my wife lying in bed, and beside her was a man in bed. And I says, what kind of dream is this? This is a strange dream. Who would I think of who would be in bed with my wife? And I said, I can't resist finding out. So I moved a little closer, and then this great shock came over me, because the person in bed with my wife was me. And then the fright came, the terror. What am I doing? Am I dying? Let me get back quick, something. So I went through the air like this, swimming through the air to get back to the body, pang, and got back in the body. That was the first time that I, in turn, found out. And then very quickly I sat up, and everything was quiet. My heart was racing because I was excited, but everything else was fine. My wife's asleep, quiet, nothing, no problem. So that is exactly how it began, all the way back in 1958. It took many visits to a doctor to find out that I did not have a brain tumor. It took reassurances from a very well-known psychiatrist friend who said, I can certify that you're sane, Bob. I said, well, what's the matter with me? And what's this thing that's happening to me? And he said, well, I think that you are doing what is known as conscious dreaming. I looked at him and I said, oh, what's conscious dreaming? He says, I don't know. I just made it up. And I said, thank you, thank you. And I then got together with my psychologist friend and I said, Brad, what do I do about this thing? He says, oh, that's easy. I says, what? He says, they do it in India all the time. They know all about it in India. And I said, well, what should I do then? He says, well, I would think you should go to India and study under a guru and live in an ashram until you know all about it. And I said, well, how long would that take? And he said, oh, probably 10 or 20 years. I said, 10 or 20 years? What about my business? What about my mortgaged house? What about my wife and my 2 children? He says, oh, this is important. And I looked at him very hard in the face and I said, Brad, if this were you, what would you do? And he looked at me with this. He says, Robert, he says, it's not happening to me. It's happening to you. And he's waved goodbye. So that was the response of that beginning. And being of a stubborn variety, and knowing that I did not have a brain tumor, knowing that physically I was all right, and the 2 people that I trusted most in the mental health field knew me so well that they said, oh, you have no mental problem. What does one do? So the natural response that I had in my way of thinking, being a Western mind, I couldn't see going to India and spending 10 years living in an ashram. That would not be very comfortable for me. And also, that's not the way I think. I'm a Western mind. So being very stubborn, what I did is to turn around and establish a research and development division in my company, taking the one that we had and moved it over in this other direction to find out what's happening to me or find out something so that I in turn could have some answers for me. So it was a very selfish motivation. And in the beginning, it was nothing noble or wanting to help the world or humankind, not that at all. I needed the help. I had a company that could spend R&D funds to do this. And that's how it began. And a footnote, bear in mind that it took a full year after this first took place for me to finally come to the conclusion that this was real, that it was not a dream, that it was not an hallucination, that it actually took place. Because my left brain, my intellect, my analytical part of me had to be knowing this, not believing it. And it took not a great adventure or a great something that took place. It was an accumulation of one verification after another, again and again and again. And after a while, I said, myself, my brain, my left brain, my total self had to say, yes, this is real. There's too much evidence. Never mind the world, but for me. And that's how it began.
Bob, after you began this this investigation into your own experiences out of your own need to understand what was happening, out of that came HemiSync. Could you tell us how the information about the influence of these sound patterns with the kind of experience that you were researching, how did that connection get made for you?
Well, again, first and foremost, I was the prime subject. That we're going all the way back to when I was in New York and had offices in New York and had a house in Westchester County. And I secretly put a laboratory on our property in Westchester because New York somehow felt too noisy. So we had this R&D program built into a 25-acre place up in Westchester County. It started very simply. We already knew how to put people to sleep. So then it began to say, well, what is this? And how are we doing this? And we had started with a very sound scientific base of using sine waves that replicated the brain waves in the human mind, the human brain, to in turn induce this sleep. Well, it didn't take much more pattern searching to determine that if we adjusted those into areas that we had not looked at before, we would begin to find something else. And sure enough, we did. And it was all the way back there in 1960 that we first began to use what we have called in recent years frequency following response. And that's where that's different from hemisync. It's different from a binaural beat type. This you can hear in open air. It doesn't require headphones to have maximum ability to listen to it. And we use that very, very broadly for a number of years. And then as life works out, we decided to move to Virginia because we were much in the ownership and operation of radio stations by that time. And we had a chance to buy a radio station in Richmond, and that was very specific. You can be very mystical about it, but I don't. It's fun to be mystical, but it's just plain point of fact. How did we get to Richmond? Very simple. My childhood was spent in Lexington, Kentucky, over here, and I wanted to be closer to the ocean because I love the ocean. So I drew a latitude line over east, and it ran through Richmond, Virginia. And I thought, well, it would be nice to have a radio station in Richmond. We had two already in North Carolina down here, and that would be close by. Well, it would be, say, about 2 weeks after I drew that line on the map that went through Richmond, Virginia, that a broker called me and he says, Mr. Monroe, I have a radio station for sale in Richmond, Virginia. And so that's how we got to Virginia. We bought the station, closed down, and moved all of our offices, including the research and development division. We moved it down to Richmond and set up a facility in Richmond, Virginia. And that's how we got to Virginia. It was nothing magical and mystical. And you could say, oh, look at what happened. You drew the line and then this magic took place. The interesting part was that I probably had asked this same broker some time back to look around, and he had found this. It wasn't that the coincidence was only maybe in time, but he had known about this station beforehand and simply called the owner, and the owner finally says, yes, I'll sell it. So it's very, very ordinary, nothing fancy. But as in terms of the hemisync process itself, the hemisync process didn't really take place until the 70s, and by that time we had moved over to Charlottesville, Virginia, and gotten into cable television, and that was the new thing to do as against radio stations. And we had, through an association with by that time I had accumulated about 8 or 9 different engineers and scientists and doctors in Virginia, and we, as a group, it was nothing, again, mystical and magical. We decided that would be the good way to do it, to create a binaural beat. And that's how hemisync was born. And that is, you know how it works, I'm sure. That's by setting one kind of signal, say 100 hertz signal in this ear, and then 104 hertz over here. And the differential, that 4 hertz, is synthesized by the mind, the brain. You can't hear it, it's too low in frequency to hear. But it is very effective to get that 4 hertz, which is a brainwave frequency, into the human mind.
Bob, hemisync has been used.
Let's cut for a second.
Yes, it has. And we.
You can even do a little tap dance there.
You know, the instruction about females.
Yeah.
Whenever you see a female going like that, and she crosses her legs and going, what does she mean?
I don't know.
Think,
Bob, what is the usefulness of hemisync in exploring different states of consciousness?
In exploring different states of consciousness, hemisync, first of all, is tremendously valuable for one reason, and that is that it's not like a drug, it's not like a chemical. It is a sound, and as a sound, it in turn doesn't invade the body, as it were. It's not even like electrical stimulation where you force the body to do things by electricity. What it also means is that the mind can accept it or reject it. In other words, it's not something that forces itself into you like this. It says here, and it is. So the applications are so broad that we really don't know all of them. We uncover new ones all the time. Let's take the extremes. You can use hemisync to keep you awake, totally focused attention, wide awake and alert. And over here, you can put a person to sleep, into natural sleep. And the in between are all of these many, many different ways, different states of consciousness that hemisync can be used to perform things. And let's go to the wake stage, first of all. You can be super awake. And what do we mean by say super awake? Intense focus of attention, concentration, so that all of your attention is focused on, say, a book or something like this. And by that focusing, you achieve much greater retention and much greater understanding just as you do focus your attention. But this helps you do it to a degree perhaps that you've never been able to do before, that type of focusing of attention. Bang, like that. Now you can change that just a little bit by, in turn, again, using hemisync, and then move into a physical pattern of stimulating physical activity. And that's why, again, focusing of attention on physical activity in sports, for example. And we have an application that we used in golf that one of the best examples we know, the president of this state golf association sliced 11 strokes off his score just by using this. It's that kind of thing. But it is because it let him focus his attention on the physical activity. Then you move, and you can see something's taking place here, that you can then move that focus of attention in many different ways. It's great because you can take that whole skein of wakefulness and use it in a number of different ways. Then the next thing that importantly takes place is that you can shift that attention, that mind consciousness, into other types of states, all the way down, and you're not even asleep yet. So look at this. And there's all of these in between. And we have some very profound ones that we've developed that, mind you, you're not asleep, but you are awake. So we have a state that we can achieve by hemisync that lets your mind be awake and your body asleep. Now that means that the characteristics of your body, your physical body, are sleep. And this makes a very, very great discovery available to you. And that is that you don't need all that physical sensory input of your five senses to be awake, to be able to think, to be conscious. And that's a great, great discovery, because we always think we have to have all this physical sensory input in order to think. We don't need it. And that's a big discovery. And hemisync lets you get there very easily to learn that important pattern. So that's an illustration. In between these things are various states of consciousness that say that let the psychiatrist or the analyst reach in and get into the various depths of that other part of that patient to find out what his problems are and let them surface, because he establishes different means of getting into them like that, but they're not the same as that strictly mind, awake, body, asleep. This hemisync pattern will let you do that. So you can see the scope of I'm speaking. It's anything that the mind can do. Hemisync lets it help you do that by changing the focus of attention, the focus of consciousness. So then that's all the way up to what we call sleep. Obviously, the always important question is, well, what about this thing you were into called out-of-body state? Well, we know where that is too. That's beyond what we normally call sleep. It's beyond that.
Padre chi?
No problem? Did I kick it?
No, no.
Si sale el micrófono, se suena.
No.
1, 2, 3.
It's okay.
We did not do nothing?
Sento un po', davanti il computer sulla bella.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Sorry,
What did you
Spirit's getting into
Très bien, très bien, très bien.
We have to come back.
do?
Il va répéter la phrase.
Can you pick up just before where you left off, back up a little bit?
So you see, one of the things that begins to emerge here is through the use of these sound patterns, we can help, not force, the mind to get into these other ways of thinking, if you put it that way, these other ways of perceiving. And as I'm prone to say, that the whole concept that I found in out of body is past this wall we call sleep. Because we think of sleep as unconsciousness, and we have all these other forms of being unconscious, and sleep is the most common of those unconscious states. So what we're doing, utilizing this hemisync, is to let the individual have, for the first time, control over his consciousness. And in relation to that, one of the key things that we have found is that this can, once we help a person learn this particular state, he in turn is as if he can restore that at will. He can, he has a memory of it and he can recall it. It's as if you can recall when you were, let's say, dancing in the dark, if you want, or whatever, that you can recall it, and there it is again. So if you have a given state created by hemisync, you remember the effect and you can be that again. Very important. So if you take that perspective, you can see that there is no limit, and steadily all the time there are various uses found for this different pattern, and there are multiple patterns. We're so far beyond just one little signal doing something. In our latest approach to it, we each, what we had as one signal is now 7 signals. And we may have as many as 5 of those one signals that were 7. So we now have something like 35 different hemisync signal patterns on one application or one use. So we've gotten very deep into it. But the whole point that's so significant to us is what has emerged out of all of this. What has come out is that, first of all, because bear in mind that we have long ago gone past, quite naturally, because I demanded it, I needed the answers. So we went past this thing, this unconsciousness called sleep, to find out what was happening later on, where we are not getting too much signals from the physical body. What's happening out there? And there was an important thing came out of it. And that is that consciousness is a continuum. It does not stop when we lose consciousness here. If we are not conscious here, we are conscious there, whatever there is. I don't pretend to say what that definition of there is, but we are there. So that means very simply, when you go to sleep here, you don't lose consciousness. You just shift along the spectrum of consciousness to another kind of wakefulness. This is, and we in turn, with this consciousness, attempt to understand that phasing, that part of human consciousness at work there. And it's very difficult. So we try it and use dreams and all sorts of things to try and attempt to understand that consciousness, that being there, again, whatever there is. And out of that, saying that we don't know how far that spectrum of consciousness goes, that long band, it's endless. And we call that the interstate. In other words, here in the United States, we have, they're not autobahns, they are freeways or interstate, which are these big highways that spread all over the country. And that's where you can go very fast and go great distances. So this is what we call consciousness, is traveling that spectrum of consciousness, is going interstate, which makes fun, of course. So I think if you begin to see that part of it, then an immediate basic came out of that whole thing there. And that is that, what are we doing? Well, you see, that's the important thing, is we let our left brain get into the act and say, what are we doing? We let our intellect, and not just our imagination, but our intellect get in and say, what are we doing? Well, we finally got around to thinking we have a pretty good way of defining, of stating what we're doing. And that is that we as humans, and let's take the simple ratio of here we are now, and we are focused our attention in time space. And we are very much, say, if you were watching this particular film, you would be focused your attention here. And that is that type of phasing. We are in phase with time space. Now, if you don't look away from the TV or something and are thinking about what you will do tomorrow morning when you get up, you are a little bit out of phase, because you're not concerned with this here now. You are thinking and doing nothing but thinking. And when you do that, then you're a little bit out of phase with time space. So you can get the patterns of phase relationships. You're still here, and your consciousness is not only here in your physical self, but you're a little bit out of phase. And as you do this a little bit more, you get beyond inattention. You have what we call daydreams. So you are focused very much in your mind here, but your body's here, and you know your body's here, and you know you're still in time space. And so there is a phase relationship. Say 60% of you is still in your physical consciousness, and 40%'s over here daydreaming somewhere. And if you move it a little bit more, you get into such things as out of control phasing that are caused by alcohol, for example, and you're drunk, or drugs, and you're all on some drug high, and it's all uncontrolled. It's tremendously uncontrolled, and you can't start it, stop it, but you're out of control, but you're out of phase. So you are perceiving two things at once: the out of control stuff here, and you have physical matter. And there begins the other very serious question, is that the person who has dementia or some form of psychosis is in a dual phase relationship and cannot differentiate between the time-space physical phasing and this other that he perceives. So he sees little men, and he hears voices and all kinds of things that are coming to him from this other phase relationship, and he can't explain it. And so he tries to mix the two to the degree that they are both the same thing, when they're really not the same thing. So he goes into a mental hospital, or they give him drugs like beta blockers to stop this other phasing. So if you think of that moving onward out through there, you can see what I mean by phasing. I can probably say, take a piece of paper and say, this, for example, is a phase relationship, and that's totally focused. Can you see it on the camera there? That's pretty good, isn't it? You don't have to focus it tight, but just get the angle. Now, as I turn this is moving slightly out of phase. So you have difficulty seeing the print more and more until this way it's very narrow. You could not even define what that is. It's just a line there. And if you're trying to read this, you're having great difficulty because you can't even see it at all now. Now you're seeing another type of something. You're seeing not this, but something else. So you're completely out of phase with time space. So it's that type of thing. These are ratios, and everything is ratio in terms of consciousness. The interesting part, of course, is that we have certain fascinating things, and that is that when there comes a point we all face, there are certain things like death and taxes we always have to face. Well, one of them we have is facing physical death, and that means that this tuning device that we have called a physical body doesn't work anymore. So we have to phase out of it, and we're completely out of phase, and this doesn't work, so we are totally there. Again, our consciousness is not dependent upon this. It's over there. And being over there is, again, a reality. And this is the thing that you begin to understand the more you get into this, that there is other realities which this mind that we have, this human state, can be conscious over in these other areas. And you can learn and do this long before you're forced to drop this physical body and go on. You can go play there.
What is the
Yeah.
significance, Bob, of this ability that you've proven that we have to contact these other realities or other phases?
I think the most important thing, first of all, is to understand these ratios, so that we can begin to, just like we do with all of our physical sciences, classify plants, biological sciences, begin to classify these other states of consciousness as to what they really are and explore them. Why do that? The first and foremost thing certainly comes out that we around here have long gotten to the stage that we know we are more than our physical body.